Welcome back to the France 24 newsroom. Moments ago, Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov of Russia has begun a press conference after holding talks with the U.S. Secretary of State Antony Blinken. Let's cross now to that press conference.
Other countries' security. And we asked Mr. Blinken and his team to comment on how exactly they interpret these commitments that were adopted at the OSCE at the highest level and were on multiple occasions confirmed there. Secretary Blinken said that he is satisfied with the exchange of views that we've just had, and this will help them present us in writing their reaction next.
Foreign Minister, hi, over here to your right. If I may in English, sorry, my Russian's not quite up to it. Last night, the State Department put out a lot of information in which they said there was no threats heading from Ukraine towards Russia. In that information, they also said that RT, my network, was directly responsible for propaganda, for reporting on neo-Nazis and right-wing groups within Ukraine. This is something that Human Rights Watch has also said. What's the Russian Foreign Ministry's response to these statements from the State Department? Also, how has the amount of weaponry from both the United States and UK that has been arriving in Ukraine, how has that affected the talks that you've been having with the Secretary of State?
Ну, вы все за меня уже рассказали, конечно.
Well, you said everything for me. These documents the State Department has prepared, especially for today's meeting, it's impossible to read these documents, but we have a special department which is headed by a special envoy of the ministry, and they are charged with studying all of that, and the response has already been given. I do not think that we should additionally comment on that. You just have to, look at these pages. You can randomly open a page, and if you read what's written there, you see that it holds no water, whatever. It falls under critical analysis. It's lies, pure and simple in many cases. Now, as far as Ukraine is concerned, we talked about it once again. Our American counterparts once again tried to push to the forefront the issues at the border between Russia and Ukraine. They tried to condition everything on the need of the so-called de-escalation, which has turned into some kind of a mantra. But I would like to reiterate once again, at the end of our meeting, we agreed that next week the U.S. is going to present us with written answers to all of our proposals. And you also said, in particular, that Ukraine represents no threat to Russia. And I would like to once again remind everyone who analyzes our public statements and our analysis, and I would like to say that never before has Russia threatened through its official representatives the Ukrainian people. Well, the Western colleagues have taken President Zelensky under their wing, condoning anything he does. And President Zelensky said that if some Ukrainian citizen doesn't feel Ukrainian and feels Russian, he or she should get out of the country. And those who fight the state terrorism in Donbass, well, he dubbed them, as you might remember, not people, but, specimens. So we do not rule out that all these hysterics propounded by our Western counterparts seeks, well, if not to provoke some forceful actions by Ukraine in Donbass, well, then at least it seeks to, hide Kyiv's attempts to sabotage the Minsk agreements. I see no other option. As far as allegations go, we have responded to everything, and when someone tells us that, yes, that's your territory, we recognize that, but there are too many troops, but at the same time, they say that it's not our business what the Americans do with their troops in Europe. And this is something we discussed with Antony Blinken during our talks today, and he agreed that the dialogue has to be more reasonable, and I do hope that the emotions will recede to the background, even though there is no guarantee that this is going to happen.
Was there any headway made on any of the points that the Russians have been raising over the past couple of weeks, which you said were very key to your security concerns? And then also, do you come out of this meeting satisfied, disappointed? How would you summarize it? And then, first and foremost, how big do you think right now the threat of war is in Europe through some sort of miscalculation with obviously such a large force gathering around Ukraine? And finally, one question that a lot of people I think have been asking internationally is, why is Russia doing this now? Why do you feel that you need to make these troop deployments now when really the security posture of the U.S. and NATO really hasn't changed over the past couple of years?
Значит, у вас видите, какая манера-то оказывается. Я думаю, что Государственному департаменту надо еще методы работы CNN проанализировать.
I think the State Department has to analyze how CNN works with regard to the accuracy of information. You say that we intend to attack Ukraine even though on multiple occasions. We have said that we never intended to do that. And when you say that this is going to happen, you ask the next question, why now? This is a very strangely formulated question. As far as our approach goes, with regard to the need to put an end to an indefinite enlargement of NATO eastwards, we once again reiterated this approach, and Secretary Blinken once again reaffirmed his position with regard to each and every country's state to have the right to their own security arrangements. And I in turn asked how, it fits with the commitment not to reinforce one's security at the expense of security of others, and he promised me that they would respond to how the U.S. interprets that. This is not the end of our dialogue, as I said, and next week, as Secretary Blinken has said on many occasions, we will get a written reaction to our initiative. Now, as far as the principled issue of NATO's non-enlargement goes, everyone is asking us why. Well, the thing is, it was set up against the Soviet Union, and for some reason it still works against Russia, and this is something that is enshrined in the doctrinal documents. Just to cite an example, let's take the Eastern Europeans, Poles in particular, the Baltic states. When they were aspiring to become NATO members, we were warning that this would be a mistake, that this would not strengthen NATO's security. We warned that this would only fuel extremist sentiment. On many occasions they said, it's quite the opposite. They were telling us we will accept them into NATO, and these phobias passed down from the Soviet times will simply disappear, and this is going to be your peaceful neighbors. But it turned out to be quite the opposite. The Russophobic minority, headed by these countries, Poland and the Baltic, are setting the tune not just in NATO but also in the European Union, making others pursue this deadlock policy with regard to Russia on all issues. So CNN, I would like to call on you to be more accurate with your facts. Izvestia, please. Nikolai Ivanov, even in his introductory remarks, Secretary Blinken was threatening. He said there would be a response to an aggression in Ukraine. So there's going to be a written response next week. So do you think the tonality is something you understand right now, that it can be predicted, or do you think something different is going to happen? As I said, once again, our American counterparts tried to put Ukraine to the foreground during our today's discussion. I understand that they have kept their concerns, but still, after our explanations, they understood that they have to concentrate on the substance, on the essence of our proposals. And a promise was given to us, I'd like to reiterate that, to provide us with a written response to our proposals next week. And I'm confident that in this or that way, Ukraine will still figure in those responses. But I have not heard any single argument today that would corroborate the U.S. position on what's happening in the Ukrainian-Russian border. Just concerns. Our concerns regarding not just some imagined threat. Our concerns about real facts, the facts that no one is hiding, the fact that weapons are being handed over to Ukraine, that hundreds of military instructors are flocking to Ukraine right now. The EU doesn't want to lag behind the US and wants to set up a training camp in Ukraine. So it's going to be quite an interesting turn in the EU's ambitions. Maybe this is an attempt by the EU to remind everyone of its existence, because so far it doesn't figure in the serious conversations. Yes, we understand that this issue requires a great deal of attention, but we shouldn't reduce the issue of European security architecture to this single issue. Regarding Ukraine, Secretary Blinken has reaffirmed what President Biden has said. He said that they are willing to help promote the implementation of the Minsk agreements, and I have called him to once again exercise their influence on the Kyiv regime to get back to their senses and to stop sabotaging this most important document that is supposed to put an end to the Ukrainian conflict. Irina, there is Russia Today Spanish. Have you touched upon the possible deployment of Russian infrastructure on Cuba, in Venezuela? How serious is this eventuality from the point of view of Russia, and are you engaged in talks with the governments of these countries? We have not touched upon this topic in our negotiations today. Task, please. Minister Lavrov, good afternoon. You said this is not your last contact. This is just a preliminary contact. You said that your contacts are going to continue, and after the written response of the U.S., there will be more contacts. Is a summit possible, and how can you comment on the decision to provide greater military assistance to Ukraine, in particular the artillery, munitions? Even though the government of the Czech Republic said that it doesn't want to be on the list of non-friendly nations that was drawn by Moscow. So can you comment on that too? So I forgot your first question. Yes, is a summit possible? I told you that we are waiting for a written response, and once this happens, we will plan a new contact at our level. Let's not get ahead of ourselves. President Putin is always ready for contacts with President Biden, but these contacts have to be prepared very seriously, and we need to understand what the outcome should be if we decide to tap into the potential of our leaders, as it were. As far as the Czech government is concerned, we hear these statements. But, of course, we need these words to turn into concrete proposals, concrete signals addressed to us. And I cannot comment on what our NATO neighbors are doing, our EU neighbors are doing with regard to Ukraine. On many occasions, we have warned that the only thing that the Kyiv regime is doing is speculating on this patronage provided to it by its Western sponsors. Once this Russophobic hysteria stops, everyone will see crystal clear that this regime is inviolable.
Jamie Keaton, Associated Press. Thank you for taking my question. I think a lot of people in the world are very concerned about these conversations, like the one with Mr. Ryabkov and Ms. Sherman last week, and the ones today. There can be some sort of progress that is being made today. You mentioned the written response from the United States next week. Could you characterize that for us, please? Is that a step in the right direction? Do you see that as a concession from the United States? And how long is Russia going to be willing to wait for satisfactory answers?
Well, do I have to tell you everything? Well, you know, this attempt to go into each and every detail. Well, I do not think it's useful right now. I have told you everything I needed to about our today's constructive, useful discussion. I cannot say whether we are on the right path or not. We will understand that once we get the American response in writing to all the points that we've enumerated. Good afternoon, Konstantin Koreshnikov, Zvezda TV channel. The State Duma is discussing the initiative to recognize the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republic. So do you think if Washington refuses to agree to these security guarantees, is Russia gonna be willing to recognize these republics after the referendum takes place there? Well, I'm not gonna speculate on that. I think the Kremlin has spoken on that already. As far as the referendum is concerned, I think this was a turning point in the history of the Ukrainian crisis after the bloody coup d'etat. And so far the State Department is trying to avoid our question as to what really had happened there from the point of view of the West. So they decide to say that, yes, there was this, and then the Crimea happened, and then the insurgency in Donbass, and then we try to remind them about the peaceful agreements between President Yanukovych and the opposition. You were the guarantors of those agreements, Poland, France, and Germany, and next morning the opposition simply tore those agreements down, putting forth Russophobic comments, requiring that Russians had to be expelled from the Crimea, and then there were militants sent to the Crimea to seize the Supreme Council, which led to a revolt of the Crimeans who demanded a referendum. Now, as for Donbass, the referendum that took place in the Donetsk and Lugansk regions was seriously discussed at the Normandy format meeting when the Minsk agreements were prepared. And the leaders of France and Germany were asking us to persuade the representatives of Donetsk and Luhansk to put their signature to those Minsk agreements. So, as a matter of fact, they decided to accommodate the Normandy 4, and they revoked their previous decision on independency, but only under the condition that the Minsk agreements would be respected, namely the special status that had to be granted to these territories. The special status had to be enshrined in the Ukrainian constitution, and the decentralization that had to happen, and of course whole amnesty, and once again elections had to be held. But everything had to be done in coordination with Donetsk and Luhansk. Well, this is where we are with the status of these territories. We spoke about that today, and we spoke about that when Foreign Minister of Germany visited us, and we spoke with the French, and we said that, everyone has to stop condoning the actions of the Kiev regime. They have to do what was agreed by the UN Security Council.
In which Emmanuel Macron proposed a new European security order to stand together against Russia. What do you think about this new order? Is it a provocation for you?
I didn't get that. Could you repeat your question, please? President Macron said that a new security order has to be created against Russia?
He proposed a new order of security for Europe, and he said it's to stay strong against Russia. Is it a provocation for you?
Я не слышал, чтобы президент Макрон призывал создать что-то против России.
Well, I didn't hear President Macron say anything about creating anything against Russia. I know that President Macron is a steady advocate of increasing the capacity of the EU to play greater role in world politics. He is a proponent of the EU's strategic autonomy. I know there is a program, the so-called strategic compass. We follow that. We understand that there is a strong influence of the so-called Russophobes, and they didn't calm down. But I did not hear President Macron citing the need to stand firm against Russia when he proposed this security order. I think there is some misunderstanding.
From the BBC. What does Russia want most? An unstable, dependent Ukraine or a new sphere of influence in Eastern Europe?
Well, you know, we spoke about spheres of influence today as well. Well, an unstable Ukraine is indeed a factor of our everyday political life, but this instability, well, I know you are an experienced journalist, and I do understand where this instability comes from. If you look at what's happening around Poroshenko's return to Kiev, all the subsequent events, how it's all organized. As for spheres of influence go, I asked Antony Blinken today, I asked him to explain. Well, after President of Kazakhstan asked for help to the CSTO based on the CSTO chapter for assistance in suppressing the terrorists, and you know, there were demands that Kazakhstan should explain why it did what it did. You know, this illustrates that the West is confident of its own special status. They are allowed to do everything, others are not allowed to do anything. Look at how the EU is behaving. Let's remember Mr. Borrell's predecessor as High Representative of the EU, Federica Mogherini, and back in 2018, when she spoke at the meeting of the EU permanent representatives, she said, I almost quote her directly, she said about the Balkans, if the EU is present there, there is no place for anyone else in this region. I think this is a very good illustration, and this applies to what's happening in Eastern Europe. Let's look at the West Balkans. There are some countries that are not part of NATO and the EU there, and attempts are undertaken to make them associate themselves. They're trying to dissuade them from having good close ties with China, with Russia. Is it not about trying to introduce their own sphere of influence? Spheres of influence exist due to the policies pursued by colonial powers. When decolonization happened, colonial powers didn't want to lose their influence. And spheres of influence was about trying to still, you know, control. It was about controlling these territories. And they're trying to expand their presence in these territories and attract new ones into their sphere of influence. We spoke about that with Mr. Blinken today, and it's a pity that adult people are involved in this, you know, measuring contest, who's tougher, who's cooler. If we all assume the adult attitude, and if we think about how we can make this world a safe place to live in, given the climate change, drug trafficking, terrorism, health issues, because people run terrible risks because of the pandemic, and I'm afraid this is not the last pandemic. These are the issues we have to think about instead of trying to reduce all of these problems to the US-Russia relations or to how President Zelensky feels in his regime. It's not true. We're not trying to get a sphere of influence. But what NATO is doing shows us unequivocally that NATO considers Ukraine to be a part of its sphere of influence. Veronika Vishnikova, RBC. Please, could you repeat that, please? Yes. Is the Foreign Ministry going to publish the U.S. response to your proposals? Well, this is not a question to us. This is a question to our American counterparts. So far, there is no response, so we're not going to raise this issue. So far, it's going to be their property which they're going to hand over to us. So I think I would like to make this response public, but I'm going to have to consult Secretary Blinken on that. Thank you.